Well, hello, it's me again. Here we are still in Joshua right at the start. And after this week's instalment, we will get moving, I promise. We're going on a trip and we need to know why we're going and what to expect. It's like we're getting all that stuff out of the way. There are battles and sieges to come. There's spying. It gets very exciting. But let's just recap about where we've got to so far. So, previously, God's people are on the edge of the land that God has promised them. They were in slavery down in Egypt, and Moses led them out. Remember all the plagues and all that stuff. And then they come through the desert to the edge of the promised land, and they send some spies into the land. And these spies take one look and just go, "Oh, actually, we're not quite sure about this. The people are very big and strong. Their cities have walls that go up to the sky. I know we've been promised this land, but I don't think we can take it." And so God tells them to go around the desert until that generation of people have actually died out. And then he's going to use Joshua to take them into the land. Joshua is one of the two spies who says, "No, we can do this. Let's go," along with Caleb. So Joshua is now at the very beginning of Joshua on the edge of the land leading God's people, and the Canaanites are already living in the land. Joshua can see them there, and they're still there just like they were 30-40 years earlier. But that's okay, as we learned in the second session. It's not their land either. It's actually God's land. Everything is God's, the world and everything, which is why Jesus is able to command it as if it's his, because it is his. So we don't therefore need to worry about anything. And there's a word that's come up a few times already, and I wonder if you've noticed it. And we're going to go back to that word today. And actually, it's the theme for the whole book of Joshua. It's really important. It's there in chapter 1, verse 3 of the Bible. So get your Bible out, get an actual Bible, a proper Bible like this, or any other Bible like this, a papery one. And go and get that, and we're going to look at Joshua chapter 1 verse 3. I'll wait while you get a Bible. It is going to appear on the screen as well, but it's better if you get a Bible. We're looking at Joshua, the 6th book of the Bible, the 6th of 66 books of the whole Bible. And Joshua 1 verse 3 says this. Okay, don't forget, the Lord is saying to Joshua, verse 3, "Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given to you, just as I promised to Moses." Just as I promised to Moses. It's there at the end. It's a theme in Joshua, the word promise. It's actually used 14 times in the book of Joshua, the word promise. But that's not a knockdown argument, I admit. But if we go towards the end, spoilers, chapter 21. Let's look that up. Joshua 21. Have a look. Flick. Joshua 21 verses 43 to 45. It's a bit of a summary statement of what's been going on for the last 20 chapters. "Thus the Lord gave to Israel all the land that he swore to give to their fathers. And they took possession of it, and they settled there. And the Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their fathers. Not one of their enemies had withstood them, for the Lord had given all their enemies into their hands. Not one word of all the good promises that the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass." Now that last verse is pretty emphatic, isn't it? Not one promise failed. All were fulfilled. And that's important because these promises actually go back beyond Moses. It wasn't originally a promise to Moses. It was renewed with Moses. It goes back to another A-list Bible celebrity. So Moses is right up there on the pantheon. He's an A-lister. But there's another A-lister whose name actually begins with A. It's not Adam, and it's not Aaron. That's double A. It's a triple A. It's Abraham. So he is a huge Bible celeb, not just because there are 3 A's in his name, but because God made a huge promise to him. And that goes back even further than Exodus. It goes back into Genesis chapter 12. And it's a really, really important moment in the history of God's people. And we need to know this, otherwise we won't get the significance of just what Joshua is doing and what God is doing as he leads Joshua and God's people into Canaan. Okay, let's go back to the very beginning. Long story, super short. God made a garden. Adam and Eve rebelled. Disaster. Their son kills their other son. Cain killed Abel, and it all goes downhill from there. The world gets worse. God sends a flood and starts again with Noah and his family. But then actually the world just keeps getting worse. Remember, we looked at how lifespans are getting shorter as well. So then they build a Tower of Babel, which is almost like a challenge to God, as if to become like God or to get God to come down to them. We don't have time to look into that. But after the Tower of Babel, God says that all of the people are the worst, and that he's going to scatter them in different directions and give them different languages to confuse their speech. And what do you know? There are suspicions between different people groups in the world. Isn't that amazing? But God starts all over again with Abraham. He's called Abraham at the time. And in Genesis 12, we see God telling Abraham, who's 75 at the time, and his wife Sarah, to go to Canaan, because they're not actually there at the moment. Yeah, he's saying, go to Canaan. That's the land I'm giving you. They went and stopped at the great tree of Moreh at Shechem, not far from where Joshua is standing here at the beginning of Joshua, or the end of Deuteronomy. There were Canaanites living in the Canaan land back then too, as you might expect. But here's what happens in Genesis 12:7. Let's look up Genesis 12:7. And it says this. Then the Lord appeared to Abraham and said, to your offspring I will give this land. To your offspring I will give this land. Okay, that's pretty big, isn't it? God had promised that land of Canaan to Abraham. Okay, this is years and years before Joshua and Moses. But not just to Abraham, but to his descendants. To Abraham's descendants. Now that in a way is even weirder, because Abraham didn't have any descendants. He was 75. He was married to Sarah, but they didn't have any children. He was 75, and she apparently wasn't able to have any children. We're actually told that in Genesis 11 verse 30, where it says, now Sarah was barren. She had no child. So it seems pretty unlikely that God's going to be able to fulfill this promise of the land, because there are people already there, but also the descendants. And yet, God has this amazing habit of keeping his promises. Not necessarily in the way that we think he's going to. He sometimes takes a lot longer to do it. But what happens? What happens? How are these promises going to be fulfilled? Look at Genesis 21. If we flick over to Genesis 21 and how the story of Abraham and Sarah pans out. But Genesis 21, against all the odds, Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of the son who was born to him, who bore him Isaac. Well, that's not exactly loads and loads of offspring, but you've got to start somewhere. From tiny acorns, huge trees grow, mighty oaks grow. But if you look what happens, eventually they have to go down to Egypt, then they come back up again. There's a load of stuff with Joseph. Genesis is a cracking read if you need stuff to read. Anyway, it's a really interesting story. But they end up living in Egypt, Abraham's descendants, and they become more and more in number. So at the beginning of Exodus 1 verse 7, but the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Isn't that interesting? They greatly increased, and the land was filled with them. But it's the wrong land. So we've kept one part of the promise about the offspring, but we've not got to the land bit yet. And that's really significant. So God, in Exodus, is taking them out of one land, which he hadn't promised them, but he's given them the offspring. And now he's taking them into the land of Canaan, which he has promised them. And as we're going to see in Joshua, God keeps all of his promises. He is never the problem. And if they do things God's way, then they go okay. It's not smooth sailing at all. And that's not to say that God isn't testing them and giving them difficult times. And that's the same for us. If we live God's way, we won't just necessarily have a life free of pain and suffering. But have we tried it God's way first? Have we tried believing the promises? We should definitely think about doing that. So, thought for the day. Do we get downhearted very quickly? Do we get downhearted very quickly, especially when things seem to be going wrong? Have we forgotten that God is in control and that he keeps his promises? God does things in his own time and in his own way, but he does keep them, even when it looks like keeping the promise is impossible when Abraham is so old and his wife can't have children, and yet they have a child, and that child has many children, and they have many children, and the promise is kept. There's no land, but then they get taken into the land, as we're going to see in Joshua. And then we get that wonderful verse from Joshua 21, where it says this. Let's just remind us of that, because I think that's a really good verse to take into the week. Joshua 21, verse 45. Not one word of all the good promises that the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass. Okay, these days you get a phone. Brilliant. New phone. Hooray, my life is saved. It's got a 1-year warranty. You can pay a bit of money for a 3-year warranty, but it's not going to last, is it? It's not going to last. These warranties are a year, they're 3 years, 5 years. Maybe if you get something really big, you might get something that's got a 10-year warranty on it. 10 years is nothing. Absolutely nothing. God's promises are rock solid for eternity, and he keeps them. And when we look at the cross, when we look at Jesus on the cross, when we look at his resurrection, we can see God keeping his promises. And he promises to come back, and he promises to make everything right. So all the injustice in the world, all the pain, all the anger, all the frustration, God's promised to sort it out. He keeps his promises. We just need to wait, and we just need to obey whilst we're waiting. Something to pray. Let's go back to Psalm 119. And let's just read this and then think about this and maybe say your own prayer at the end. Okay, ready? Psalm 119, verse 41. We can't read all of Psalm 119. It's massive. But here's one section of it. Verse 41. Let your steadfast love come to me, O Lord, your salvation according to your promise. Then shall I have an answer for him who taunts me, for I trust in your word. And take not the word of truth utterly out of my mouth, for my hope is in your rules. I will keep your law continually forever and ever, and I shall walk in a wide place, for I have sought your precepts. I will also speak of your testimonies before kings, and shall not be put to shame. For I find my delight in your commandments, which I love. I will lift up my hands towards your commandments, which I love, and I will meditate on your statutes. Just say a prayer to yourself. And let's give that an amen. Amen. When I say do a prayer to yourself, do a prayer to God, but you could say it to yourself, to God. You probably got the idea. Something to say. Maybe if somebody says, what did you learn or what do you think about? Just talk about promises. When did you last break a promise? And how are we different from God? What are his promises like? And therefore, he is our hope and our salvation, not people, not things, but God. Okay, that's it for this time. There's a little bit more to come with the action replay. Stick around for that. Otherwise, see you next time. Okay, action replay. Here we go. We've looked about ages and how people were older in the Old Testament. Adam was too old to have kids, was he? He was 75. Well, that's nothing. He's a spring chicken in comparison to some people in the early chapters of Genesis. But the ages keep going down. And just before we encounter Abraham in Genesis 12, look at the end of Genesis 11, and you'll see Shelah, Eber, Peleg, and Serug having kids in their 30s. Their lifespans are getting shorter, and they're having kids younger and younger, and sin continues to infect the world. Terah is a blip, and then he becomes Abraham's dad at 70. That's unusually high, and unusual births in the Bible normally tell us that the baby that's born is going to be significant. So Abraham is a significant baby because his father is a father at 70, and Abraham is older even than that. So quite often the Bible establishes a rule, and then a rule is broken, and the rule is broken, it's meant to attract attention to itself. It's like, this is not normal, so pay attention. Okay, so that's the first thing. Second thing, where was Abraham before his travels to Canaan? It's okay. Take a moment. I'm afraid I need to push you for an answer. That's where he was. The city of near Babylon. 500 miles east of Shechem, and he went on that long journey. He believed God's promises, and went on that journey to see the land that he was being promised, or that was being promised to his descendants. And then finally, Isaac. Well, what I love about Isaac, the name means he laughs, and that's because when Sarah was told that she was going to have a baby, she laughed because she just didn't really believe it. She thought it's ridiculous. And I love the humanity of that Sarah finds it funny, and that actually they bake that line into the name of Isaac. And Isaac, one of the great patriarchs of the Christian faith and of the Judeo-Christian faith, his name means he laughs, and I think that's quite fun. So anyway, I hope you find those bits of action replays interesting, and I will speak to you next time.